Those of you investing in US defense companies have probably had a very traumatic week watching prices tumble. On the other hand, those of you who are investing in European defense manufacturers are probably getting whiplash from how hard line go up. So, what is happening? Prime US defense manufacturers haven't been doing so well this year across the board. However, the most recent dip happened February 13th, the day after Donald Trump announced that talks were starting between the US and Russia over ending the war in Ukraine. As a part of this announcement, the US made numerous concessions to Russia, such as acknowledging that restoring pre 2014 Ukrainian borders is unrealistic and distancing the US from being committed to European defense. While some of the defense dip can be attributed to the US reducing military spending as its military support for Ukraine dies down, some of it is certainly attributable to the increasing divide between the US and its supposed allies in NATO. As the US works against the European interests and gets more isolationist, it becomes a less attractive military partner because an ally and partner you can't count on is one that you never want around in the first place. So, what is NATO? NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a defensive military alliance formed shortly after the end of World War II between most of the Western European countries that fought alongside one another against the Axis. It was created due to the instability and highly militarized position Europe found itself in after the war's end. You now had a bunch of countries with large, advanced, and well trained militaries who were used to war as a means of interaction. World leaders at the time, however, were understandably tired of having their countries destroyed and people killed during fighting. This whole World War thing was even worse the second time around, and there was a lot of incentive in finding out ways to avoid there ever being a third. The solution? Create a military alliance between so many rich, capable, and influential nations that would be suicidal to trifle with. An alliance whose military and economic power was so great that any gains you could hope to achieve from a war would be far outweighed by the damage your own population and economy would sustain in the process. In essence, NATO was the alliance equivalent of a nuclear bomb that aimed to win wars in the most effective way possible, by preventing them from starting in the first place. The logic behind an alliance like a deterrent in this way is pretty straightforward. Say you are in a bar with a couple of your buddies and a big scary guy walks up to you looking for a fight. You and your friends aren't pushovers, just regular dudes who could collectively put up a fight if need be. This scary figure staring the three of you down might not be certain he can kick all your asses, but he's confident enough in victory to roll the dice. Given that you and your friends are fighting 3-on-1, chances are you win the fight. However, even if you win, chances are that at least one, if not more of you, will get seriously hurt in the process. Okay, so let's reset this scenario. But this time, instead of there being 3 of you in the group, there's 15, and you have some scary individuals of your own to back you up. This time, the big scary guy walks up, and despite still being the same strong and violent person, he has no illusions about his chances of victory. Sure, he might get a punch or two off, but any injury he could hope to inflict is vastly outweighed by the legendary ass-kicking he faces by crossing you. These hypotheticals are the basic reasoning behind any effective alliance structure. Having friends is nice, nicer still if they are willing to back you up, but ultimately to be effective, an alliance needs to be so great that its sheer strength prevents wars rather than just winning them. This deterrent effect is one of the core selling points of NATO, as every member nation can be confident in never having to fight a war in the first place so long as the alliance's strength is maintained. That last bit is crucial and worth focusing on, as some NATO members are notorious for failing to meet their end of the alliance bargain. To avoid one member of the alliance shouldering the economic burden of funding a military committed to defending everyone, each member must agree to spending a specified percent of GDP on their military. NATO is kind enough to have historical data on alliance spending over the last 50 years readily available online, and some of it paints a clear picture of an uneven alliance. In 2014, following Russia's annexation of Crimea, NATO members agreed to a 2% GDP military spending goal in order to shore up the alliance's strength in the face of renewed Russian aggression. And while collectively European members raised their total percent investment from 1.43% in 2014 to 2.02% in 2024, this average does not tell the whole story. The graph up on screen is a nice visualization of military spending from NATO allies between the years of 2021 and 2024. That time frame is particularly insightful as it gives a snapshot of defense spending before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and a snapshot of what spending looks like once the initial shock died down. As you can see, the 2021 snapshot illustrates the gap between the alliance's strength on paper versus what countries were actually willing to contribute. In 2021, just 6 of the 32 NATO members met that 2% funding goal, with some members like Luxembourg, Spain, and Belgium barely even achieving half their pledged contribution, if they even achieved that. Data like this is undoubtedly one of the reasons Russian planners stared down Ukraine in 2022 and decided to roll the dice. Just like our example in the bar, Russia saw weakness, and despite knowing the risks associated with starting a full scale war in Europe, it was emboldened by NATO's anemic response to its aggression in 2014 and continued lack of response in the years following. The 2021 funding figures are evidence of an alliance missing the point. NATO members were spending some of their GDP on their militaries, but not enough to instill the fear of a legendary ass kicking in the Kremlin. Even now, almost 3 years into a large scale bloody war started by the primary threat NATO was created to guard against, some member states still fail to meet even 75% of their NATO funding obligation. It makes sense then why longtime military staples in NATO, like the US, have for decades been hounding NATO members that fail to meet military funding goals. One can easily find statements from past and current US presidents urging NATO's underachievers to start doing their part. In 2016, Obama agreed with then President elect Donald Trump that they needed to start pulling their weight. Previously that year, Trump had campaigned on not defending NATO members who failed to reach the 2% spending goal, and even threatened to pull out of the organization completely numerous times over his view that the US was having to foot the bill for other countries failing to spend enough. While it isn't true that other countries owed the US money by failing to meet their obligations, it is true that their failure in the long run contributed to the current European crisis that is the Ukraine war. One would struggle to see a reality where Russia rolls the dice in 2022 if former military powers like Germany, Italy, France had met their military goals in the years following Crimea's annexation, even less so if they had kept up with military spending prior to 2014. So, why is this time different? Why is 2025 any different from previous years? After all, Trump continually threatened to leave NATO or abandon certain members in the event of war over failures to meet spending goals during his first term between 2016 and 2020. In my view, the difference lies in the existential threat to European security that the Ukraine war poses. The speculation on whether Russia's territorial ambitions were satiated after taking Crimea in 2014 is long over. Russia will not stop with Crimea, the Donbass, or anywhere as long as it is not dragged into a wider war with NATO. Many cautioned about this eventuality in 2014, but now takes claiming that Ukraine represents the extent of Russian ambition only come from voices like Tim Pool, who have a direct money trail to the Kremlin. Europe also now has every reason to believe that the United States' path back into isolationism wasn't limited to a 4-year Trump presidency. Perhaps the most vocal anti NATO president in U.S. history is back in the White House and shows no sign of changing his rhetoric. In his first few weeks in office, Trump has threatened tariffs on its nearest strategic ally, Canada, and has done the same to European NATO member Denmark over the territory of Greenland. Europe then faces enemies on both sides and from within NATO itself. An openly militaristic threat in Russia to the east, and an open economic threat in the United States to the west. These two threats compound on each other and give Europe the greatest incentive it has had in decades to develop military autonomy and forego relying on the US for its military might. The problem this creates for NATO is multifaceted. While, yes, European military autonomy might finally cause its European member states to consistently meet and exceed the 2% funding goal, it would come at the cost of permanently damaging the alliance structure. Believe it or not, countries don't like allying with and depending on people who openly threaten them. While this kind of behavior might have been written off in Trump's first term as a more aggressive way to try and get European states to fund their militaries more, we now have direct evidence that Trump is willing to economically damage even the closest US allies as a means to an end. Now then, put yourself in the shoes of a prospective European buyer of military goods. Do I want to do business with a US firm whose parent country may at the drop of a hat change its strategic goals, who, like an abusive ex, might dial me in the long hours of the night with threats of tariffs if I don't do something they want? Or would I go with the European manufacturer who may be willing to build factories in my country, employ my citizens, deliver a good product, and not show up drunk knocking on my door at 3 in the morning. Now, the situation is certainly much more complex than this, but the question remains the same. Why would a European country continue to choose to do business with the US when it is given more reasons to go elsewhere every year? One of the main reasons is simply the US's ability to produce some of the most advanced military systems in the world. What manufacturer is the UK going to go with when purchasing a fifth generation stealth fighter? Sukhoi? Something tells me that Russia may have trouble fulfilling that order for Su 57s, even if it wasn't involved in a proxy war with you. So, okay, quality then is a big reason why Europe can't stop buying from the US overnight. However, this advantage for the US is limited to certain sets of military equipment. No European defense company may be able to produce a fifth generation fighter, but they sure can produce a fantastic tank in the Leopard 2, or a fantastic self propelled artillery piece in the PZH 2000, a fantastic cruise missile in the Storm Shadow, or, well, you get my point. The US no longer has a monopoly on advanced systems in the areas most needed during a ground war in Europe, at least from what we've seen in the war in Ukraine. Fifth generation fighters certainly increase your combat effectiveness, but Ukraine hasn't needed them to give the Russian Air Force fits when it comes to achieving air superiority. Despite Ukraine having an air force made up entirely of Soviet relics, Russia was unable to control the skies even in the early days of the full scale fighting back in 2022. That would lead me to argue that fourth generation European air platforms are still more than capable of dealing with the current threat they face to the east. That isn't to say advancements aren't needed, rather, that at least in Europe, the disparity between European and Russian made platforms is smaller than Moscow would like you to believe. That then leaves at least one critical hurdle in the way before Europe can comfortably part with US systems, and that is simply is quantity. It doesn't matter if you build the greatest system in the world if you can't build enough of them to equip a single unit. Su 57, T 14 Armada. Production scale is crucial, especially during wartime when the difference in units rolling off the floor quickly means whether your country can go on the offensive or not, or re equip the units that are in fighting. To date, Europe has produced a meager amount of even their best systems when compared to their US counterparts. Despite making one of the best tanks of the world, Leopard 2, only about 3,600 have been produced since the model's inception back in 1979. And in comparison, over 10,000 Abrams tanks have been produced by the US despite not equipping many different countries. That isn't to say European manufacturers are incapable of scaling up production. However, if wait times for European systems are much longer than American ones, it still might make more sense to purchase the US made stuff, even if it comes with some downsides. That decision would then lower quantity of the model the producer has on order, incentivizing the European company to not scale up production, and we're back at square one. If these troubles still exist in the European manufacturing space, why is this video then titled The Effective End of NATO? The reason for the title is because this most recent spat between the US and the rest of the alliance feels different. Once one of your own supposed allies starts repeating Russian propaganda points and sidestepping your alliance to make deals with your rival, trust starts to degrade. Once trust is degraded, every facet of an alliance, from military production agreements to defense assurances, can begin to break down as well. Could anyone in good conscience confidently say in 2025 that Donald Trump would assuredly come to fight with NATO if Russia started a provocation in, say, Finland or somewhere else in the Baltics? I certainly couldn't. And once you lose faith in one ally coming to your aid, cracks in the alliance structure give way to serious faults. If the constituent nations lose confidence in even a couple countries fulfilling their end of a defense pact, should bullets start flying, they will start making decisions as if the alliance doesn't exist. Extrapolating from there, even if the US didn't officially pull out of NATO, a lack of trust in their military support would effectively neuter the alliance. How could countries whose militaries are equipped largely with US equipment confidently stand up to Russia when they aren't sure they'll be able to get replacements for their equipment or even military support if a war starts? Once you are reliant on a country and their military production for your own defense, you are effectively subservient to them, as any action you take which jeopardizes that supply chain would spell disaster. For example, countries like Canada, who are now a part of the F-35 program, have another lever the US can pull when exerting political pressure. Typically, this is why you only purchase complex weapon systems that require a lot of time, investment, and training from your closest allies, based on the assumption they won't screw you over. However, with a country like the US, whose political winds blow back and forth every 4 to 8 years, it becomes harder and harder to justify that expense, reliance, and trust as competitive platforms enter the market from other allied nations. The news this week of Trump starting talks directly with Putin over ending the Ukraine war is just another crack in the failing foundation. The war in Ukraine is the biggest direct threat Europe has seen in decades, and the de facto leader of the alliance is sidestepping its allies to negotiate with the rival dictator that unapologetically started the crisis. How these talks will go is ultimately still anyone's guess. However, it is impossible to look at the situation and not see a clear divide forming between US and European interests. It is hard to imagine how NATO continues should the US try to exploit a European humanitarian and security crisis to get a profitable trade deal for itself at Europe's expense. How could one commit to a long-term alliance, sign trade deals with, or fight alongside a country that manipulates every facet of your relationship to its advantage? That question may be answered in the years to come, and as European defense autonomy continues to grow as incentives for military independence from the US do, we'll see if NATO survives as the United States distances itself from Europe and Europe distances itself in turn. So now, here we are in 2025 looking ahead to the remainder of Trump's second term in office. American defense stocks continue to fall, European ones continue to rise, and every week a new pain point between the US and its allies appears. Many onlookers are asking themselves how much Europe will put up with, and the question is undeniably on the minds of European leaders as well. My goal of this video is not to claim that NATO is destined to fail or that it will fail in the next few years. More so, I'm trying to give a picture of the increasing tension between the US and Europe and how defense economics will reflect a shift in their relationship. If long-term contracts or deliveries of complex US systems to European countries such as F-35 start to get canceled or drastically slow down, that to me would be an indicator that Europe is dedicated to its deviation from the US. Obviously, if a European country outright said it would not be purchasing further American weapons, that would be a clear sign. However, doing so would signal a clear threat to U.S. interests that the U.S. government would likely respond to in turn with something like tariffs. I think the more likely scenario, if they're serious about autonomy, is that European states continue to scale up their production and quietly make deals with each other while gradually reducing their purchasing of US made systems. Only once a plan is formed would Europe outright state its intention to formally begin distancing itself from the US, and at that point, it would likely be too late for the US to regain its former foothold, regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office. Military alliances and military procurement are both inherently long-term commitments. If the current US administration continues to pursue isolation and short-term profits at the expense of our allies, the current cracks in NATO will give way to a full collapse. Anyways, thank you all for tuning in. This video was inspired by the internet's favorite PowerPoint warrior, Perun. If you haven't checked out his channel, please do so, as it is some of the best content you can find anywhere when it comes to understanding how militaries function and reflect political standings. Links to sources used are below, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.